In 11.2, we are going to be talking about the integers that we learned about last lesson, again, whole numbers, and we are going to be adding them. So notice when I was talking about integers, I never said that they were positive whole numbers. It's any whole number. So in this lesson, we're going to be learning about integers that have the negative sign applied before them, and so negative, and then we're going to be learning about positive integers and adding those together. So add integers to determine if the sum of them is positive, negative, or 0. That's going to be the focus of our lesson today. So for the first one, the first example, we're going to add integers with the same sign. So when you're looking to add integers with the same sign, we are going to be talking about absolute value, just like we were learning about in 11.1. So we're going to look at the absolute value of -3 and the absolute value of -12. So absolute value of -3 is 3, and the absolute value of -12 is 12. Okay. You could use a number line to check your answer to visually see what the sum of these would be. We are going to go ahead and add them together, and then we are going to apply the sign that they share. So find your absolute values, 3 and 12, add those together, and you get 15. The second step is to notice that they shared the negative sign, so we are going to apply that sign at the end. So the sum of -3 and -12 is -15. You can determine that by finding the absolute values of each number and then noticing what sign they shared and applying that to the beginning. So once again, add the absolute values of the integers and then use the common sign. We are going to be using a lot of absolute value in this lesson. All right, sorry for that pause there. All right, so we can try that again with these next two. We've got 2 and 5, so if we find the absolute value of 2 and the absolute value of 5, you've got 2 plus 5, and that equals 7. They are both positive. That's the sign that they share, so we just leave it as 7. And then if we were going to be looking at the same type of idea, but with negatives applied, the absolute value of -2 is 2. The absolute value of -5 is 5. Add them together to once again get 7. However, remember the second step is to look to see what sign they share. They share the negative, so you put that in front of the 7 in this case, making a -2 plus a -5 with a value of -7. So here's the key idea that we want to come away with from 11.2 from adding integers, or one key idea. So two numbers that are the same distance from 0, but on the opposite sides of 0 are called opposites. So here we've got the number 2. It is 2 away from 0. And we've got a -2, which is 2 away from 0. So we can say that -2 and 2 are opposites. And we're going to be coming back to this idea in the last example that we look at today. All right, adding integers with different signs. So broke this down into 2 steps. The first thing we're going to do is subtract the lesser absolute value. So we're still working with absolute value, but this time we are going to subtract them. It seems a little counterintuitive to subtract when you want to add, but I think you're going to find that it makes it pretty easy once you get the hang of it. So subtract the lesser absolute value from the greater absolute value. So once again, we're finding the absolute value of 2 numbers in this case, and then we are going to be subtracting. Okay, so once we've done the subtraction after We've established what the absolute value is. Then we use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. So we really need to keep in mind what they were before we turned them into their absolute values to determine if they should have the negative or positive sign applied at the end. So again, we'll have the negative or the absolute value of 8 and negative 10. So we have 8 and 10. I'm going to subtract the lesser absolute value. And yes, I know we want to add, but bear with me. We're going to subtract the 8 from 10, and we get 2. Okay, keep in mind step 2. This is, clearly it's very important. We can't forget this. Then you are going to use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. The integer with the greater absolute value is this one here. This integer had a negative sign to begin with, so I need to apply that negative here. Over here, I've got the absolute value of negative 13 and the absolute value of 17. So the absolute value of negative 13 is 13. The absolute value of 17 is 17. I'm going to subtract the lesser value from the greater value. That leaves me with 4. Now, step 2, use the sign of the integer with the greater absolute value. The integer with the greater absolute value is 17. 17 is positive, so this remains a positive 4. Working with the additive inverse property, that is the sum of an integer and its additive inverse or opposite. So just like we saw back in that first example on the last page, when you have a positive 6 in this case and you're adding it to its negative additive inverse, its opposite, you are going to end up with 0. It is 6 away from 0, and a negative 6 is also 6 away from 0. That will equal 0. Negative 25 being added to its additive inverse or opposite of a positive 25 is going to result in 0 as well. All right, we're going to be adding integers with different signs in this one. So we are going to once again be finding the absolute value of each of these numbers. So the absolute value of 11 and the absolute value of 6. That would give us 11 and 6. And once again, we are going to subtract just like we did in the last step. So I'm going to subtract the lesser from the greater, and that's going to give me 5. And then I look to see which sign belongs with the integer with the greatest absolute value, and that is a negative. So a negative 5, because the greatest absolute value here was the integer that was negative 11. So I'm going to take a positive 12 and I'm going to add it to a negative 5. 12 plus 5. Remember, we're not going to solve for this through addition, we're going to solve this through subtraction. I've gotten each of their absolute values, take the lesser value away from the greater value, and you get a 7. The greatest integer here, the greater value, had a positive, so I leave it as a positive. And then here we are again with our opposites, our additive inverses, 4 and 4. So I subtract them from each other, and you end up with 0. And finally, what do we do when we have more than 2 integers to add? Okay, so for this we have an example. Down here you can see that we've got some July transactions. So if you had your bank account and you were pulling money out and you were putting money in. So let's say we made a withdrawal in July of negative 40 of $40. You deposited 50, you deposited 75, and then you made a withdrawal of 50 again. So here's how our equation would look. Negative 40 plus 50 plus 75 plus another withdrawal, but this time it was a negative 50. Okay. So I'm going to use my commutative property of addition here to rewrite this equation. So I'm going to keep it as a negative 40, But then I'm going to move the 75 so I can get the positive 50 and the negative 50 next to each other. And you'll see why that's helpful in just a minute. So I could do that through the use of the commutative property of addition, because it doesn't matter which order I have them in. So now I can use the associative property of addition to do some elimination. So the first thing I want to do is solve for this set of numbers here. And I notice just what I noticed at the beginning of the lesson, that I now have a positive and its additive inverse negative. I have a positive 50 and its opposite of negative 50. And so that is going to equal 0. So I solved for that first, recognized they were going to cancel each other out, put that 0 in my equation, go back and rewrite the rest of the equation. So negative 40 plus 75 plus 0. And so now I'm going to once again find those absolute values to solve for the final piece of this problem here. Okay, so I've got absolute value of negative 40 is 40, absolute value of 75 is 75. I'm going to subtract the lesser value, and I end up with 35. Go back to see which one of these is greater. Well, the 75 is greater, and it had the positive applied to it, so I keep this a positive 35. So nice job. Overall in July, you ended up with positive $35 in your account.